James, and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of this video series where I'm sharing about my personal study and practice of cartomancy with playing cards. In the first installment of this video series, I gave an introduction and then I talked about my personal associations for the colors red and black in a playing card deck, and then I talked about my associations and meanings that I have for each of the 4 suits in a deck. And if you haven't watched that introduction and you'd like to, I will leave a link to it in the description box below. In this video, we're going to jump right in and begin talking about the meanings and associations that I have for each of the cards. And in this video, we're going to start with the aces as a whole. So in the next segment, I'm going to be talking about my association for the aces as well as my associations for the number 1 because they correspond and they correlate with one another. And then we're going to be moving on to my meanings for each of the 4 cards individually. So without any further ado, let's shift gears and begin talking about the aces and the number 1. And here we are with the aces in the deck, and the deck that's assisting me throughout this video series is the Tally-Ho playing cards. This is number 13 in their series. And this deck is by Jackson Robinson of King's Wild Project. And so when it comes to the aces, some of my associations for them are something new, something beginning, the start of something, and potential for the future. Those are my immediate associations with the aces. Now the ace corresponds to the number 1. And so some of the associations I have for the number 1 is just like the aces. It can represent something new, something beginning, something starting, and it can also represent a starting point because the symbol for the number 1 for me is a dot. And so for me that can represent a point. Now some of the other things that I think about with number 1 is individual or individuality. I also think of origin and something being original. I also think of initiation, and that would be just like the beginning stage, and playing on that it would be an initial stage. So initiation and initial. Now the number 1 can also represent a leader and also a director, so you can think of leadership with the number 1. And then because I love pop culture, I try to use some pop culture references or associations with the number 1. So you can think of things like numero uno or the one and only. I also think of somebody being single or going solo, or something being alone or a loner. And I'm pretty sure I got this from a pop song, but sometimes with the number 1 I think of the expression 1 is the loneliest number. I also think of solitary and being independent or independence. So just as I asked you to consider in the first video when it came to color and suits, what associations do you have for the number 1? When you think of the number 1, what comes to mind? Because those could be associations that you use in regards to the aces. And so with that, let's begin to take a closer look at the aces one by one. And here we have the first of the aces, the ace of hearts. And so now I just want to remind you of some of my associations when it comes to the suit of hearts. In the first video for me, I talked about hearts representing things like feelings and emotions, relationships, love, and healing. So keeping some of those associations in mind, the ace of hearts for me can represent a new emotional experience. It could also represent a new love, the beginning of a relationship, and with that, relationship potential, and also this idea of feeling independent or feeling alone. Now my first immediate go-to association for the ace of hearts is home and family, and with that the ace of hearts can also represent a family member. For me, this card can turn up when there is a change in residence. And some of my other associations for the Ace of Hearts are family of origin, playing on the idea that the number 1 can represent something original or origin. It can also represent a starter home. If we go with the idea that the ace is the number 1, it can represent the start of something, and then the Ace of Hearts representing home. So a starter home. I also tend to think of the expression with this card, home is where the heart is, or a home that has potential. Playing on the family aspect of the card, this could represent the start or starting a family. And then the last thing that I want to talk about with this card is that the suit of hearts can also represent healing. So this card could represent the beginning or starting to heal. And so those are my associations for the Ace of Hearts. So now let's turn our attention to the next ace. Next up, we have the Ace of Clubs. So just as I did with the suit of hearts, I'll remind you that for me, clubs can represent work and business. Those are my first go-to associations for the suit of clubs. But it can also represent social. So that could represent social circles or social activity. And then I also think of progress with the suit of clubs. So with that in mind, some of my associations for the Ace of Clubs is new work or new business, potential business, and beginning to make progress. Now, just as the Ace of Hearts can represent a home, for me the Ace of Clubs can represent some kind of building. And then surrounding cards could describe what type of building. If the Ace of Hearts shows up as the subject of a reading for the home, and then the Ace of Clubs appears in the same reading, it could represent the foundation or a cellar in a home. Now, when it comes to the Ace of Clubs, I also think of legal documents or legal paperwork. And besides work and business, the potential for work and business, as my immediate go-to associations for the Ace of Clubs, I also tend to think of a contract. And if you work with Lenormand, you'll find a similarity with that because the ring card has the Ace of Clubs as its playing card insert. So again, with the Ace of Clubs, I think of a contract. And along the lines of contractual work or something having to do with legalities or legal documents or paperwork, I tend to think of the Ace of Clubs as representing, the government or government work or service. And then playing with some of my other associations for the number 1, the Ace of Clubs for me can represent working independently. Remember, the number 1 for me represented independent and independence. And then also going with the social aspect of the card, this could come up at a time when one is beginning to become more social. So it could represent beginning to be social or becoming more social, the start of that. So those are my associations for the Ace of Clubs. And now we'll move on to the next ace in our video, and that is the Ace of Diamonds. And here we are with the third of the 4 aces, and this is the Ace of Diamonds. And so my associations for the suit of diamonds are things like material resources, material circumstances or concerns. With that, I tend to think of money immediately. It can also represent rewards, success, and power, and also energy. So those are my associations for the suit. Now, the Ace of Diamonds in particular, my immediate go-to associations for this card are a letter or some form of written correspondence. This is a card for me that represents news or a message. It can also represent an invitation. And symbolically, playing on the suit emblem, it can represent a diamond ring, and with that, it can imply an engagement. But now, I also tend to think of engagement as some kind of event, not just a couple getting engaged. So for me, this card can also represent an engagement, meaning some kind of social event, social gathering, something of that nature. Now, some other associations with this card for me is that it can represent the potential for success, the start of money coming in, a potential reward. It can also represent a new material resource and a new source of income. So those are my associations for the Ace of Diamonds. And now let's move on to the last ace, the Ace of Spades. And here we are with the final ace for this video installment, and that is the Ace of Spades. So now if you remember, my associations for the suit of spades are problems, challenges, difficulties, obstacles, hurdles, and blocks. But again, with that, spades can also reinforce this idea of making decisions and solving problems, right? Allowing us to use our ability to solve problems and make decisions when they show up in a reading. And so now my immediate go-to associations with the Ace of Spades are, I think of the mind, and I also think of a decision. Now some other ideas for the Ace of Spades could be a potential problem, the beginning of a problem or difficulty, a difficult start, a new idea or a new way of thinking. Sometimes this card can represent the rebuilding of your life. And with that, I want to mention that this card has become known as the death card. But I don't read it in death, meaning literal death, unless other cards are confirming that or validating that. I wouldn't just go off with that idea or impression with just this one card. But along those lines, I tend to think of death representing some kind of transition or a transformative process or transformation. So when I think of the idea of death, I think of it more along those lines than physical death. And with that, the Ace of Spades can represent an awakening, and I tend to think of the expression, the renewing of your mind. And so those are the associations that I have for the Ace of Spades. And there you have it. We've covered the aces in the deck, and in the next video in this series, we'll take a closer look at the twos, all the two cards. So until then, I'm James Himm Mitchell. I'd like to thank you for sharing space here with me for this installment of this video series. And I look forward to seeing you again and being with you again in the next video installment. So until then, take care, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.